Prophecy, one of God's great witnesses. Mail out week, continue to work through the evidence that points to the existence of God. Continue to work through the evidence specifically beginning last month and for the next couple of months. Evidence for the validity of the Bible. That this is exactly what it claims to be, God's inspired word. That God breathed into men of old through the centuries, and they recorded the message, and then God preserved it for us. Working through that, you cannot help but encounter prophecy. It is one of the great witnesses to this book. The whys of that include separation, time, when God says something and then fulfills it years later after bringing about everything necessary to get to that point. The specific nature of the prophecies, specific names are given, specific places or mentioned, and the nature of the prophecies themselves. Sometimes they're single prophecies. They refer to a single. Sometimes they're double prophecies, and those are even cooler. When God says something that relates to the generation He's in, or we're in at that moment, and then there's another fulfillment years down the road. Let's start with some definitions. Make sure we understand what we're talking about. A prophet is one who speaks forth. He speaks by the authority of God. Now then, it can be a lot of different things. But when he does speak, he prophesies. The speaking forth of the mind and the counsel of God. Vine's Expository Dictionary of New Testament Words says, though much of Old Testament prophecy was purely predictive, prophecy is not necessarily, nor even primarily, foretelling. It goes on to say that prophecy is the declaration of that which cannot be known by natural means. It is the foretelling of the will of God. It can be in reference to the past, therefore it's not foretelling. It can be in reference to the present. It can be in reference to the future. That last part is what we think of when we think of a prophet, when we think of someone prophesying. But what I want you to understand, if we simplify that, to prophesy is simply to speak forth, is to speak out, is to speak for God. And it can be a history lesson. It can be an inspired revelation. It can be foretelling. Foretelling is the one that we get wrapped up in. And that's okay, at least for this morning. Moments where God tells us, sometimes centuries in advance, of exactly what's going to happen. Who's going to do it? Where He's going to do it. That's when the message is called a prophecy. It's predictive in nature. Sometimes it's through a medium. God uses prophets. He uses Nathan in the case of Daniel. He uses Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Jonah and all these guys. It can be God Himself. Sometimes God bypasses the prophet and just comes and tells Abraham, this is what's going to happen. There are 300 plus prophecies about Jesus alone. Some count as high as 365. If that's the case, that's a pretty cool number to connect to Christ. We get one a day for a year to study. When it comes to the prophecies about Jesus, we get the specifics. Where He would be born. Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. We see Him born exactly where we're told, in the city of Bethlehem. And God not only says it, but then God, through providence, has to bring it about where Jesus travels to Bethlehem. Or Mary and Joseph travel to Bethlehem to birth Him there. We get that He's born of a virgin. That's one of those, and it's one of the coolest prophecies in all of history. This double prophecy. Isaiah 7:14, a young woman, there's no side note, some people get all tore up when they pick up a copy of the Bible and they turn to Isaiah 7:14 and the word virgin is not in Isaiah 7:14. There's good reason. There is no Hebrew word for the word virgin. It is young maiden. Why? Because a young maiden was assumed to be a virgin, pure and simple. So a young maiden is going to give birth to a child. Before he can digest certain foods, these things are going to take place. And it relates directly to that day and age. The first part of the prophecy. Probably to Isaiah's son. Then years later in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 23, we find out it's actually a double prophecy. That he was speaking of a young maiden in his day, and the prophecy being that young woman walking right across there, if you read the language. But Matthew goes back and says, oh, by the way, years later it's going to refer to a true virgin. One who's never known a man, and she's going to give birth to a child, and he's going to be called Emmanuel. God with us. And that prophecy is fulfilled twice. His trip to Egypt is prophesied. Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1, that he would have to escape for his life. It's actually another double prophecy. Because the first time it's said what? It said, my child's going to go to Egypt, and the more I call him, the further he's going to get from me. He's talking about Israel coming out of Egypt. Certainly not talking about Jesus the first time, because when God called him, he came. So Matthew chapter 2 and verse 14, we get a double prophecy. Jesus comes forth out of Egypt. The price that would be paid for his head is prophesied. Zechariah 11 and verse 12, 30 pieces of silver. It's all Judas wanted. The fact he would be mocked, the fact that he would be pierced, the fact that he would be crucified. This prophecy is fascinating because he predicts this about himself. And Ed referenced it, John 3 and verse 14. Serpent raised up in the wilderness, I'll be raised up. And then it's fulfilled by the hand of someone else. Do you know that even what he would say on the cross was prophesied? Psalm 22 and verse 1, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That he would die with the wicked and be buried with the rich, Isaiah chapter 53. Fascinating details that when piled up point to Jesus as the Messiah that God has been identifying for centuries, to the point that's part of the problem. When Jesus looks at the religious leaders and says, you of all people should have known. You should recognize me because all the evidence is available to you. But there are so many others beyond the ones that deal with the life and death of Jesus that are so fascinating. One of the coolest prophecies in all of history is about a man named Cyrus. who would release the Jews from captivity. Watch this. He's mentioned in Isaiah 44, 28 through 45:1. That's an unfortunate chapter break there. That when the time came, a man by the name of Cyrus would come into power and would rescue God's people and send them back. And they were going to get to build the temple. They were going to get to return to Jerusalem. 2 Chronicles 36, 22 and 23. Ezra chapters 1, 3, and 4. Cyrus comes to power. Now then, that might not be so impressive if it was not a Jew prophesying the name of a pagan. Because it wasn't like they could control what the leaders of other nations were going to name their children or who was going to come to power. Encyclopedia Britannica, of all places. In 538 BC, Cyrus granted to the Jews whom Nebuchadnezzar had transported to Babylonia the return to Palestine and the rebuilding of Jerusalem and its temple. P.S. Isaiah named him by name 150 years before Cyrus was born. Is that an accident? Is that human power? Hardly. God's involved. God tells us the future, and then by the works of His hands brings it about exactly like He says He will. We're going to talk about the church tonight. Come back for that one, please. If you're online, tune back in for that, please. You can identify, Ephesians chapter 4, the one body. You can identify the one body, the church, through prophecy that dates all the way back to the days of David. And step by step it builds up and tells us when, where, by whom, and how long it's going to last. We're going to look at that tonight. Now Genesis 11 and 12. One of the others that is so fascinating is this multifold prophecy, or this series of prophecies about Abraham. And we pick up his story in Genesis chapter 11. And one of the things that makes this one so neat is because God keeps adding details to it that are specific, that He then has to bring about. Another thing is the distance in time. How far out God predicts these things before He brings them about. And in Abraham's case, those layers allow it to be 30 years in advance, and then 1 year in advance, and then 400 years in advance, and then 1,400 years in advance with the different layers. Genesis 11, Terah, Abraham, and the rest of the fam leave Ur of Chaldees. We find out from Acts chapter 7 when Stephen gives his inspired message that there's actually two calls of Abraham. We don't get them both recorded in Genesis. What we get in Genesis is suddenly the family packed up and left. Why? Well, Acts chapter 7, because God called them. We get the second call in Genesis 12, and there we begin to get pieces of this prophecy put into place. So the second call in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham, I want you to leave your family, leave your land, go to the place that I will tell you, and I'm going to make you a great nation. Now, when we read Genesis 11 and 12, what was one of the key notes made towards the end of chapter 11? Sarai was barren. Abraham, you and your wife have no children, but I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to make your name great. this point, when we first introduced to him, there's nothing special about this man. Abraham, through you, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed. And that's just the beginning. Verse 7, as they're sojourning, God adds to the prophecy. The land that I'm going to show you, this land, I'm going to give this to you. Canaan. You're not going to possess it now. In fact, you're not ever going to possess a single square foot of it. But you will possess it through your family one day. Chapter 15 in verse 5, Abraham, a man with no children, your descendants are going to number the stars. God is stacking up prophecies that it does not look like in the beginning he can fulfill. Because Abraham doesn't have any children. He doesn't have any descendants. He can't be a nation. He's one man in a tent. Chapter 15, verse 13. Those descendants are going to be strangers and enslaved for 400 years. So now we're beginning to get some time frames added to this as to exactly when God has to fulfill some things. Verse 14 of that same chapter, after that 400 years, I'm going to bust up that nation, and your people are going to walk out of there, and they're going to be rich. Notice the layers. Chapter 17. I'm not just going to make you a nation. How about we just make you a multitude of nations? Then chapter 18, still no son. Sarah's still barren. And God comes back and he says, all right, let's get started on this now. You're going to have a son, and it's going to be exactly a year from now. God, you're setting yourself up. You're sure laying out a whole lot of details and a whole lot of specifics that have to take place exactly right for you to be a truth teller. Now, it is one thing to make a general prediction and get it right. It's another thing to make hundreds of predictions, like say a Nostradamus, and get a few of them right by sheer chance. It is another thing altogether to make hundreds of specific prophecies and get them right every time. 1 year later, Abraham has a son. Accident? Hardly. His wife's past the age of bearing children, and he's past the age of fathering children. All right, God, you got one of them. By the way, that's 30 years after the first call in Genesis 11 and 25 years after the second call in Genesis 12. God's not limited by time. That son, Isaac, is going to have two. And they're going to split. And so now we're going to have that multitude of nations. Because God's going to allow both of them to flourish. The one through whom that line finishes or continues, by the way, is barren. Ends up having a bunch of sons. So Abraham marries a woman who's barren, and God promises a multitude of nations. Isaac marries a woman who is barren. God's promised a multitude of nations. Jacob marries a woman that's the one that he wants to marry in the first place, and she's barren. And all three times God steps in because God has a plan. And God has said, this is exactly what I'm going to do, when I'm going to do it, and how I'm going to do it. And he continues that line to the point that when they end up in Egypt, they're a nation. They get 70. 400 years later, from the beginning of it, they bust out of Egypt. They leave rich. They plunder the nation of Egypt. Go ask your neighbors for gold. Sure, all right. Hey neighbor, I want gold because we're leaving this place. Here you go. Take it. And they're somewhere around 1 million strong. So from one who was married to a barren woman, 400 years later, we're 1 million strong. We're a great nation. Abraham's name is now known, and they walk back to Canaan and take it. And it is theirs. That singular line from Abraham that could have stopped multiple times continues all the way to Jesus. The seed promise given in Genesis chapter 3 to the mother of all living, Eve. And all nations have been blessed. We'll tie that to that tonight, Isaiah chapter 2, Acts chapter 1 and 2. Prophecies. And then he added to them step by step, and he fulfilled them on time without exception, including ones that were date related. 1 year from now, 400 years from now. Every prophecy, every detail, numbers of layers, numbers of times it could have failed. Think about, and I have emphasized this to my teenage class and to the young adult class that's working through this same material. Think about the number of times God's plan is one barren wife away from failing. Think of the number of times that an outside force tries to eradicate Abraham's descendants and prevent the birth of the Christ. And yet God fulfills His prophecies every time. The evidence piles up that this book is exactly what it says it is. That it is God's inspired word, and He spoke it into existence years before these things happened. So let's close with this. Back to those prophecies about Christ. He prophesied that He would die for the sins of the many. And so He did. He prophesied that He would satisfy a debt. So He did. All of that, even though it takes place in our world and on our calendar around AD 30, was signed, sealed, and delivered before the foundation of the world. Revelation 13 and verse 8. The Lamb slain before the foundation of the world. God had already in His mind both prophesied the death of His Son and fulfilled it before He ever made us. All for us. All of the prophecies are for us. They're about saving us to His glory. So let's finish that thought. I read recently of a man who spent 5 months in prison due to the fact that he was unaware that his bail was $2. Okay, now you think about the absurdity of that. Low price, payable, someone should have told him. We are surrounded by a world with an unpayable debt that has already been paid. The debt for our sins was paid before the foundation of the world because God decreed it. I'm telling you that now. I don't want you to sit in a prison of sin trying to pay a debt or a bail that you cannot pay when it's already been paid. Don't die with that debt on your ledger. And the prophecies we've looked at, and the hundreds more that there are that God has already fulfilled, are proof that He tells the truth. Proof that He can do exactly what He says He's going to do. Which lends proof to Calvary that it is exactly what He says it is. It is a sacrifice for my sins. And that it does exactly what He says it will do. It washes away my sins through obedience to the gospel. He's paid your debt. Will you accept it this morning? If you will, please come as we stand and sing.
Someday you'll stand at the bottom.